Thank you all for being here. We appreciate the support. I didn't want to be helped, didn't want to be comforted, wanted to be mad, but hearing the life he lived, it brings us some comfort, and it's going to help us get through this. I wrote some stuff, and I'm just going to read it. I used to think my dad didn't understand order, organization, or protocol. But I was wrong, and George can attest to this because I wrote a whole memo of what we needed to do and how things needed to be organized, but I was wrong. It's not that he didn't understand it. He was just not ever willing to put protocol over people. If you knew him, you knew he didn't mind hugging someone who had AIDS, or giving a job to an alcoholic, or listening to a habitual liar. It's so abnormal, so unorthodox, but whether he wanted to do these good deeds or not, if he felt the urging of God to do it, he would comply. And I just want to talk about him for a second, as I do remember this. A man who at one time found himself sleeping on a train in Chicago, frequently drugged out and in dangerous situations. But if you knew my dad, you knew all that changed. If you knew my dad, you knew he didn't care who all came, just as long as everybody was fed. If you knew my dad, you knew he would leave the front row if he felt like someone was lonely in the back row. If you knew my dad, you knew he would stop everything in order to let you know how much you were loved by God. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd leave his home if you needed prayer at yours. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd give a chance when no one else would. If you knew my dad, you knew when others had written you off, he'd write you in. If you knew my dad, you knew he didn't care about protocol more than he cared about people. If you knew my dad, you knew he pioneered a message of God's love and grace decades before the most famous communicators in the land were talking about it. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd raise his voice for the person who had no voice. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd raise his voice if he was in an argument too. If you knew my dad, you knew he was just as happy to know the janitor as he was to know the judge. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd show up for your court date if at all possible. If you knew my dad, you knew he believed you couldn't love others properly until you learned to love yourself properly. If you knew my dad, you knew he'd tell you if your cooking was bad. If you knew my dad, you knew he was interested in getting to know you. Oh, God. Oh, Father. If you knew my dad, he was interested in getting to know you, to spend time with you, to really be concerned and interested in what was concerning and interesting to you. If you knew my dad, you knew sometimes he wouldn't give an explanation because he was just moving as he felt God was leading him. If you knew my dad, you knew he was going to do what he wanted to do. If you knew my dad, you knew he absolutely hated things that he felt was stupid. If you knew my dad, you knew he gave God all the credit for absolutely turning his life around. If you knew my dad, you knew he loved dressing nice, but wasn't ever ashamed to shop at the Goodwill. If you knew my dad, you knew he was stubborn and made mistakes. If you knew my dad, you knew he wasn't super concerned about the past. He had plans, but wasn't too far into the future. he would take things one day at a time. If you knew my dad, you knew he loved some cheap gas and would drive out of the way to get it. If you knew my dad, you knew he believed every human had built-in, innate value because they were created by God. And if he got any inkling that you didn't see yourself as valuable, he was going to make it his business to raise your awareness about your own value as a human and your value in the eyes of God. If you knew my dad, you know he was ride or die. If you needed a secret kept, you could trust him to keep it. If you knew my dad, you knew he wasn't perfect, but he was real. If you knew my dad, you know that he'd want you to know God in a personal way and to live every day trying to line up to his guidance for your life. If you knew my dad, you knew that he had strong faith, which gave him a strong foundation, which enabled him to attract a strong wife. You've been strong, Mama. We proud of you. Oh, God. Whew. Which helped him build a strong family, which helped him build strong friendships, strong followers. We appreciate the church members and people in the community, which allowed him to not just leave this earth, but to also leave a legacy. Daddy, we don't like it. In fact, I hate it. We weren't ready, and all of us aren't doing so well. But our hope and plan is to continue to build on everything you taught us. And for growing up, not really knowing your father, you've been one heck of a father to us. You did well. We may never stop crying, but we've all got a portion of your flag, and it says love on humanity. We may all do it our own unique way, but we will do it. Like you told me on what would become your deathbed. This is what he told me, y'all. One, he said God was bringing a lot of people to his mind, and he was praying for y'all. But he also told me that he was blessed beyond measure. And it wasn't because of money. It wasn't because of anything material. But everything to do with his family and the way God had used him. And I'm just here to say publicly, we were blessed beyond measure to have our father in our lives. Love you forever, Dad.